Order, order. Mrs. Sharon Hodgson to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Sir Charles. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I beg to move that this House has considered the prevention of sexual violence in conflict. My thanks go to LFI and the British Israel All-Party Group and others for the briefings that they have provided for this today, and to Baroness Hellick, who is a leading campaigner on this issue. The focus of this debate is to ensure that we keep shining a light on the horror that is the use of sexual violence in conflict. Throughout history, as we all know, sexual violence was considered as just part of the spoils of war, with the rape, enslavement and murder, particularly of women and girls, forming an accepted part of the narrative of conflicts over centuries. Finally, a breakthrough came just 30 years ago. Armed conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo saw the deliberate use of mass sexual violence, which evoked a loud and very angry response from global women's organisations and human rights activists, which couldn't be ignored. Under this pressure, the United Nations Security Council created the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993. Significantly, this had an unprecedented commitment to prosecute rape as a crime against humanity, along with other war crimes. A Rwandan tribunal followed with the same objective. In the year 2000, which really was not that long ago, we have to say, the UN Security Council recognised women's perspectives, rights and roles in relation to peace and security for the very first time. I am pleased to say this initiative was championed by the UK Labour government at the time. In more recent years, we have also seen important steps taken, such as the government's creation of UK Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan and the establishment of the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative, PSVI, which has been allocated funding. However, in an increasingly volatile world, women and girls continue to bear the brunt of violence. The gender justice that these legal frameworks and tribunals are designed to ensure has been insufficient. Today, the use of sexual violence in conflict and the denial and dismissal that so often occurs after it remains a constant scourge waged in conflicts around the world. Shockingly, just last month, the UN's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, reported that wartime sexual violence had increased by 50% in 2023 compared to the previous year. Perhaps the most well-known example of our failure to tackle sexual violence in conflict in the past year was the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israeli women and girls on the 7th of October. Most of the victims of this violence were subsequently murdered, so we may never have a full account of what actually took place. Nonetheless, I will. Happy to give way.
For giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate. Just on the issue of issues not being fully reported, would you agree with me that one of the advantages we have in the West is that where there is a free press, these issues are highlighted as they are being today, but in some of the more repressive regimes, we hear very little, if any, of the types of sexual violence that she is quite rightly alluding to today.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, because that's a very important point and one that I haven't included in my opening remarks, so I thank him for that. So nonetheless, what happened on the 7th of October, it was a well-documented case of mass sexual violence, in part because the terrorist perpetrators proudly filmed and advertised their crimes. One account from a first responder at Kibbutz Be'eri reported finding piles and piles of dead women completely naked from the waist down, as well as horrifying reports of sexual mutilation. A survivor of the Supernova Music Festival massacre, Yoni Sadon, recalled, "I saw this beautiful woman with the face of an angel and 8 or 10 of the fighters beating and raping her. When they finished, they were laughing and the last one shot her in the head." Tragically, Hamas's use of rape as a weapon of war may not be over yet. Reports indicate female and male hostages have been sexually assaulted and abused during their incarceration. The fact that sexual violence was committed at multiple locations suggests it was part of a systematic effort. As the Israeli women's rights campaigner, Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari, told the BBC, such a concentration of cases in a relatively short span of time left her in no doubt that there was a premeditated plan to use sexual violence as a weapon of war.
Will the honourable member wait?
I happily give it.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. Does she share with me the anguish, really, at the fact that the United Nations did not chose not to recognise that sexual violence was taking place during the attack on the 7th of October? And does she further share with me the horror when the testimony I heard from a woman who was responsible for looking at the bodies when they came into the mortuary, that she talked about the greyness that confronted her, and that every now and then there was a bit of shining colour, and that shining colour was the nail varnish that was left on the bodies of people who had been sexually abused and then killed.
I do agree with her on that point, and I also heard the testimony about that. And that very day, I had bright red nails, unlike sort of the paler version I've got today, and that really struck me in a profound way. So, as she said, despite, for months after the 7th of October attacks, there was a deafening silence from many organisations and international agencies supposedly dedicated to addressing these kinds of crimes. And the best the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls could initially respond with was a very evasive expression of concern about the reports of sexual violence that may have occurred since 7th of October, committed by state and non-state actors against Israelis and Palestinians. And that was a direct quote. Another agency, UN Women, supposedly dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women, issued multiple statements following 7th of October, none of which addressed Hamas's sex crimes. So it's deeply concerning that this has been mirrored in the response of progressive groups, some of whom have refused to believe eyewitnesses' testimonies and who sought to characterise evidence as unverified accusations, even though the evidence of organised, systematic, planned attacks in different locations at the same time is clear. The choice made by many, and this is what we've seen in conflicts around the world, to downplay the testimonies of survivors and ignore the evidence of those who were murdered, show just how far we still have to go to change attitudes, even amongst groups who purport to believe all women. However, it is important to note, as I've said, that whilst it is particularly stark in relation to the sexual assault committed on October 7th, and I cite that one as it is the most recent of these atrocities that we've seen, the denial and the dismissal that comes with sexual assault in this case is not unique. Many conflicts receive less international attention, and reports of sexual violence are often met with an international wall of silence or an ineffective expressions of concern. In this regard, it is important to raise attention to the serious allegations of sexual violence reported by interlocutors in Ramallah who raised concerns about the treatment of Palestinians in detention, and in particular the use of sexual harassment and threats of rape during house raids and at checkpoints. In both 2021 and 2022, the Democratic Republic of Congo had the world's highest levels of verified cases of sexual violence against children committed by armed forces and armed groups. Yet how many of us here today knew that fact? Clearly, so far, maybe more in this room than in other parts of society probably would have known that fact, I have to say. Clearly, so far, we have failed to achieve the far-reaching change the world needs. An important component of this, I believe, is that sexual violence in conflict is seen as an unintended consequence of conflict, instead of a heinous act which is in parallel with other war crimes. So, where do we go from here to address this? Well, we must centre women's voices in peace negotiations to help ensure that the victims of sexual violence and conflict receive recognition of the crimes against them. to ensure that crimes of sexual violence are recognised in parallel with other war crimes, and to provide alternative perspectives on the impact that conflict has. We must also hold to account government initiatives such as UK Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan for 2023 to 27 to ensure that its commitment to put women at the centre of conflict resolution, peace-building programmes over the next 5 years is realised. I'm happy to give way.
Thank you. Thank the honourable member for bringing forward this important debate and allowing me to intervene. There are 614 million women and girls living in conflict regions. Women often face disproportionate violence in those conflict zones, and in fact sexual violence is often used as a against women in conflict, as you've already so powerfully set out. So do you, the honourable member, agree with me that it's the UK's moral obligation to provide humanitarian support and funding to help rebuild infrastructure in those conflict zones and increase our international aid to 0.7% of GNI?
Sharon Hodgson.
Lady for her intervention, and it stands as what she said. I agree with. I do think the UK needs to play a leading role in this regard in particular. Secondly, as I was saying, the international community should work to create an international commission whose sole mandate is to focus on sexual violence in conflict. Again, this would be, for the Honourable Lady's point, us leading the way on this matter. This idea has been pioneered by Baroness Hellick, informed by her role, helped create the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, and inspired by the International Commission on Missing Persons, which was formed following an agreement during the G8 that is now transformed into a treaty-based body which works in over 40 countries. There are currently gaps in international architecture, which means sexual violence is slipping through the net. Instruments used to achieve justice internationally are only able to focus on perpetrators at the highest levels, and national courts often experience limited resources or a lack of willingness. Like the International Commission on Missing Persons, which has the dual aims of ensuring the cooperation of governments and others in addressing the issues of missing persons and providing technical assistance to governments in locating, recovering and identifying missing persons, this commission would provide a similar function. It would also have a two-pronged approach. Firstly, working with governments and other international bodies to coordinate the deployment of experts in countries where sexual violence in conflict has occurred to help collect that vital evidence and record testimonies in a sensitive way and build up local expertise. We know that on October the 7th, the primary focus of emergency services was responding to the heinous act of terror, which over time meant forensic evidence of sexual violence diminished. Should a body like this have existed, they could have provided a key role in collecting that vital evidence in a timely but culturally sensitive manner that would ultimately have helped refute all the denials. It would, secondly, act as a centre for excellence, helping to drive forward forensic technology that could help in confirming the use of sexual violence and provide a space to share best practice, train and educate investigators and discuss preventative strategies. I believe having such a body would provide the much-needed tools and joined-up cooperation required to hold perpetrators to account and bring victims justice. I believe we must take these steps to prevent progress made so far from backsliding, to ensure meaningful justice for victims, to deter future crimes and to press for further international change that will make the difference. We cannot afford not to take steps to address sexual violence in conflict, because those who have been victims of it and those who will sadly, no matter what we do, become victims of it in the future cannot afford for us not to. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered the prevention of sexual violence in conflict. I call Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Sir Charles. It's a real pleasure to be called, and and to be called so early as well.
It's a first for something.
I'm so used to being bobbing up and down and then sitting back down again. But anyway, it's great to be here, and I look very much forward to everyone's contribution. Can I particularly thank the Honourable Lady for Washington and Sunderland West for securing this debate. Whenever I seen this debate, I really wanted to speak on this. I want to give some examples as well across the world and different perspectives. But for me, the violence that happens to ladies and young girls across this world is horrendous. It upsets me, it annoys me, it makes me physically and emotionally annoyed, and sometimes I cringe whenever I think of some of the things that happen. As members of this House, we have a platform to raise awareness of significant human rights concerns. And we're here to advocate for those who are subjected to some of the most extreme cases of violence that threaten their safety, their freedom, and their dignity. And for me, every one of those 3 points is incredibly important. This debate has been called at a time when the world is witnessing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War. Indeed, as a person of faith, the Bible talks about there will be wars and rumours of wars, and I've never in my lifetime, Sir Charles, can remember as many wars and as many rumours of wars as there is. And it tells me that the Bible's indication that the last times are coming, perhaps, is something that maybe we should all be taking note of in relation to that. The fact makes me shudder, makes me physically, emotionally cringe, knowing that this entails a rise in conflict-based sexual violence. The UN verified 3,688 cases of conflict-based sexual violence last year alone, a 50% increase from the previous year. Women and girls account for 95% of those cases, and children account for 32%. How could anyone, Sir Charles, anyone in this world carry out anything sexual against a child? I guess anybody, but against a child in particular. The sexual violence occurs in conflicts across the world, with the highest numbers recorded in Ethiopia. As the Honourable Lady said, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I read some time ago there in Ukraine that the attacks on women and girls as young as 8-year-old and as old as 80. I mean, can you envisage what that means? That these people think, them Russian monsters, because that's what they are, think it's okay to abuse girls and women just whenever they want. That's the world we live in. That's why this debate is so important. I look very much forward to hearing the shadow ministers from the SNP and my good friend, the shadow minister for the Labour Party. I often say that when she's in Westminster Hall, so am I. And I thank her for her contributions on these debates, which she says with such passion and belief. The ministers in this place will not be disappointed in the minister's response. I'll say that later on, but I do look very much forward to his contribution as well. I want to reiterate just one story. It's pertinent to this debate because I visited Israel the week after Easter. I had occasion to go over and we visited. The Honourable Lady referred to the Nova music, and it really unnerved me a wee bit, because I felt like when I was walking through the Nova music festival place, I almost felt like I was walking. Well, we were walking where people were murdered. And it really quite disturbed me, Sir Charles. And we met some of the families. I'm going to quote the lady's name. The mother's name was Amanda Dalmari, and she told the story of her daughter. Her daughter is Emily, and the story of Emily is one who was kidnapped by the Hamas terrorists that they are, and she's been unheard of for the last 3 months. Now, we know an Honourable Lady for Washington and Sunderland on Sunderland West outlined the case of what's happening, and her mummy was. We wouldn't dwell on it too much, because we can understand what the mum was thinking and what we were all thinking, perhaps, you know. But so since that day, as I vowed I would do, I have made sure that Amanda, the mother, and Emily, the daughter, are very much on my prayer list, and I've indicated the others are charged to ensure that they're on the prayer list of many, many others as well, because I'm a great believer in prayer. It would be, in this debate, be remiss not to mention, and I think it's important to do, mention men and boys subjected to conflict-based violence as well. They're not. It's happened in Ukraine. It's happened in other parts of the world. Many countries do not include this demographic in the scope of sexual violence legislation. Sexual violence against men and boys most often occurs within the context of detention and interrogation, and that's the examples that I'd be aware of. Although I'm sure there's many others that happen as well. As a person of faith, myself, and as chair of the APPG for International Freedom of Religion or Belief, I feel obliged, very much obliged for this debate, to draw attention to the vulnerability of religious minorities to whom sexual violence is something that's ongoing in conflict. It is terrible. And each and every one of those conflicts, each time I represent or make a comment about some of the countries across the world, I find that those who are of a Christian faith or minority faiths find themselves in a position where they're being abused, they're being victimised, first of all, human rights, and then they're being abused because they have a faith. The APPG speaks up for those with Christian faith, those with other faith, and those with no faith. All those things, because it's really important to do so. And as chair of the APPG, I do that regularly for all groups. Militant groups and terrorist organisations will often target members of opposing ethnic, religious or political groups. Those belonging to religious minority communities have the freedom to exercise their faith stripped from them, oftentimes in conflict-affected areas. So if you're a Christian or you're a member of an ethnic minority, you automatically will receive sexual abuse as well. It makes you vulnerable. They specifically target you, and it's something we must speak about. Before, their religion provided them with identity and purpose, but during conflict, it makes them particularly vulnerable to sexual violence. Recently, and just a couple of years ago now, I had the opportunity to travel to Nigeria and meet the mother of Leah Sharby. Leah Sharby was kidnapped, one of the wee schoolgirls that was kidnapped. She has never been released, although we did hope there about a month ago we'd heard some rumours, stories coming through to say that she would be released, but unfortunately that fell through. So we were hoping that would happen. But Leah refused to renounce her faith as a Christian and convert to Islam. She was kidnapped by Boko Haram and forced to marry one of their fighters. The latest story coming from that is that young Leah Sharby has 3 children and has been subjected to abuse over a number of years. We met Leah's mother, and the pain of Leah's mother was palatable and deeply saddening. I witnessed how the pain of those subjected to sexual violence ripples through their families and through their communities. And indeed, all of those young schoolgirls that were kidnapped, and some of them still held, including Leah Sharby, underlines that case. This experience has greatly affected me and motivates me to speak at today's debate. Leah's reality is an unfortunate reality for many girls, not only in Nigeria but worldwide as well. So it's so important for this debate to be voiced, and we're all here to do that, and thank all the members for their contributions in advance. The UK is recognised as a global leader in promoting human rights, and we must utilise this role to advocate for those affected by conflict-based sexual violence. So I praise, and I do it on purpose, where praise is due, always give it, because if criticism is also due, we also do that too often. But I praise our Minister and our government for exhibiting excellent leadership in tackling conflict-related sexual violence by establishing the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict Initiative. When I was in Israel, again to cast back, one of the Israeli lady MPs had said that she wished to establish something similar in Israel, and I know that was her intention. I put her in touch with some of the MPs who unfortunately aren't here today for various reasons, but so they could come here and have that engagement and try to press those things that are happening in Israel. The PSVI's goal to rally global action to end conflict-based sexual violence has led to the empowerment of other governments as well. And that's an example, by the way. what we're doing here as doing that for Israel, to lead efforts in different areas of this issue. Others have echoed the statement that the current aid allocated does not near the amount needed to match the issue's magnitude. So maybe in summing up, the Minister could perhaps give us some indication of what's been done. I conclude with this comment. I thank the FCDO for all they have done thus far. However, it is evident that more needs to be done to support those globally who are victimised on a daily basis. And I think for all of those young girls, young ladies, for boys and girls as well, maybe not in the same numbers, who are being sexually abused, we have a right to be their voice in this Westminster Hall today. And I thank the Honourable Lady for bringing this forward. It's a pleasure to come along, not a pleasure. It's incumbent of me to be here to support the Honourable Lady and what she's brought forward, because this subject matter, while difficult to talk about, is one that we can't ignore. Thank you.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Charles. Pleasure to serve under your chairship today and to be speaking in this incredibly important debate. Can I begin by thanking my good friend, the Honourable Member for Washington and Sunderland West, for securing today's debate. Sexual violence is the most forgotten and one of the most reprehensible weapons of war. It is, as the United Nations has rightly stated, rarely simple, the action of rogue soldiers, but a deliberate, planned tactic designed to terrorise, assert power and inflict lasting trauma and psychological scars. And it has a particularly sickening attraction for its perpetrators. As Amnesty International put it, rape is cheaper than bullets. While the conflict in Bosnia saw the first ever convictions for mass rape as a war crime, this hardly seems to have served as a deterrent. In recent years, women and girls in Ukraine, northern Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo have been subjected to horrific sexual war crimes. But we have no hope of combating this evil if we cannot even acknowledge its existence, if we cannot agree that it must never be ignored, doubted or dismissed, and if we cannot recognise that rape is rape, whatever the victim's race, religion or nationality. That is why I wanted to briefly comment about the abhorrent acts of sexual violence committed by Hamas in its attack on southern Israel on the 7th of October. As we have already heard, these were acts of exceptional brutality. As Meni Binyamin, the head of the International Crime Investigations Unit of the Israeli police, has suggested, it was the most extreme sexual abuse we have ever seen. Truly horrifying acts of rape, sexual mutilation and torture. An extensive investigation carried out by the New York Times in December, which utilised video footage, photographs, GPS data from mobile phones and interviews with over 150 people, including witnesses, medical personnel, soldiers and rape counsellors, all identified at least 7 locations where Israeli women and girls were sexually assaulted and mutilated. They included the site of the Nova Music Festival, Kibbutz Bari and Kibbutz Kfar Asar. The attacks against women were not isolated events, the New York Times concluded, but part of a broader pattern of gender-based violence. This confirms the analysis made by Professor Ruth Halpern-Kadari, an expert on family law and international women's rights and Israeli women's groups. But these were atrocities which the world, including those supposedly committed to human rights and the safety of women and girls, has decided to downplay and ignore. It took over 7 weeks for the UN Security General to call for an investigation into Hamas's campaign of rape. It took UN Women, which says it is dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women, 50 days to even acknowledge that these crimes had occurred. Where was the sisterhood? Where were the feminists? Me too, unless you're a Jew. Well, let the call come from this House today, directly to those women. We are here to tell you that we see you, we hear you, and we believe you. I had the privilege of being present at the sitting of the UN Security Council where Special Representative Pramila Patten presented her report on the sexual violence that took place on the 7th of October. Describing her experience as unlike anything she had witnessed elsewhere in the world, Patten said, "The world outside cannot understand the magnitude of this event." Her report outlined the desperate need and moral imperative for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the unspeakable suffering on the Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. If the conflict and violence overseas were not bad enough, we know that this has had a knock-on effect on the levels of violence against women and girls here in the UK. Here in the UK, Jewish Women's Aid stands virtually alone among charities dedicated to combating violence against women and speaking out about these brutal events. And I know from my discussions with them as the Shadow Minister for Domestic Abuse and Safeguarding that the accusations levelled at Israeli women that they were lying about the brutal rapes and sexual violence which took place on the 7th of October served to undermine confidence in the services that Jewish Women's Aid offers. As Deborah Lipstadt, the US Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, and Ambassador Michelle Taylor, the US Permanent Representative to the UN Human Rights Council, have argued, this reaction is in stark contrast to the global gender-based violence movement's typical emphasis on the importance of listening to and believing survivors' accounts. Sexual violence is seen as a weapon of war all over the globe. According to the National Prosecutor's Office, there have been over 200 accounts recorded of sexual abuse committed by Russians during its war in Ukraine that have begun proceeding through Ukrainian courts. Since the start of the brutal armed conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces in mid-April 2023, conflict-related rape and sexual violence against women and girls in Sudan has increased significantly. And as conflict escalates in Gaza and the Middle East, UN experts describe credible allegations that Palestinian women and girls have been subject to sexual assault, including rape, and are calling for a full investigation. At least 2 Palestinian detainees have been raped, with others being subject to multiple forms of sexual assault and humiliation. And again, these brutal events are not solely confined overseas and have led to a rise in incidents of Islamophobia and abuse here in the UK. Just yesterday, I was told by police and Tell Mama that since October the 7th and the escalating conflict in the Middle East, there has been a dramatic increase in incidents of domestic abuse in Muslim households reported to them right here in the UK. This once again demonstrates that British Muslim women have borne the majority of the brunt of anti-Muslim hate during this time. The devastating truth is that sexual violence is commonplace in war, but this does not have to be the case. Let us be clear that rape and sexual violence must never be used as a weapon of war, and those seeking to capitalise on foreign events to spread hatred at home will not be allowed to get away with it. Preventative work is key to tackling this, and I am pleased that work is already being done through initiatives that we've already heard of, such as the PSVI. Cross-departmental work like this is essential to tackling this issue. And while we can do little to alleviate the suffering of victims, survivors and their families, we can stand here today and speak up on their behalf and acknowledge these devastating crimes. No matter where they are positioned on the globe, victims and survivors deserve to be listened to, validated and believed. Thank you.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Sir Charles. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today and a true honour to be part of this debate, which I have a feeling is going to be this place at its best. At its best when it speaks for those who cannot yet be heard. At its best when it does confront difficult truths in our society and makes a plan to act. And I hope, and I say this in advance, I suspect the Minister shares that concern on this matter. And so what we are doing today is pushing at an open door, because sadly this is something we have seen for many, many years. Let me start by joining the member for Sunderland West in honouring Baroness Hellick and her work on this matter, as well as the member for achieving this debate. I mean, such a powerful opening speech, and indeed I agree with everything that has been said by my colleagues. I pay tribute to my colleague from Pontypridd, who's just blown us all apart with her powerful call to action. International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict is on the 19th of June. So the Minister has a mere couple of weeks to agree and put in place what we're going to decide today should happen in this House. But I think that should be a very easy task, because the asks are very simple. The ask is that we must act because we know this is getting worse. And that's where I'm not possibly going to join with the member for Strangford in suggesting that we are in the end of days just yet. I respect that as part of his faith, but I do recognise we do live in a very uncertain world, that 6 out of 7 worldwide are plagued by a feeling of insecurity, that we are facing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War, and 2 billion people, a quarter of all humanity, are therefore in places affected by those conflicts. The challenge that we face here today is too often sexual violence is seen as an inevitable consequence of such conflict. As day follows night, so women will be violated. That is not the case. Women are not mere collateral damage to conflict. And so the first thing we must do in this House is to challenge that very notion. Frankly, that complacency, that it's part of the process. And so the challenge that we have is to find a way just to stop it. No, we need to prevent it. And we prevent it by, first of all, recognising that this does not need to happen. It is chilling to me that many NGOs talk about how for those who fight wars, sexual assault is seen as more destructive than using fire to damage a community because of the damage and the damage that comes for generations as a result. We should recognise that across the world there are 15 conflict-related settings where there is active concern that sexual-based violence is taking place. Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Libya, Mali, Myanmar, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine and Yemen. That there are 3 post-conflict settings where we are, again, equally concerned that this is a very live issue. The Western Balkans, Nepal and Sri Lanka, and 3 situations of concern to the UN where they think there may be further sexual violence taking place, Ethiopia, Haiti and Nigeria. Little wonder there are over 3,500 verified cases of sexual violence that were reported last year alone, a 50% increase in the reporting cycle. The highest numbers being reported in Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But I suspect that's because that has been going on the longest and therefore there is the most capacity to record. We should recognise the evidence and call out the victims across the world, therefore, and recognise that we stand with them in the way that Member for Pontypridd has rightly said we stand with those women in Israel and Gaza. In Sri Lanka, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights recognised that during the conflicts with the Tamil Tigers, there has been a horrific level of violation and abuse, including indiscriminate shelling, extrajudicial killings, and the use of torture and sexual violence. Whilst it's difficult to get accurate numbers, we know that at least 500,000 women were raped during the Rwandan genocide and 50,000 in the war in Bosnia. We know that rape and sexual violence are the hallmarks of the military genocide for the Rohingya women, that the Women's League of Burma documented more than 100 cases of conflict-related sexual or gender-based violence during the coup. And we know that there is evidence from the Ukraine, and the member for Strangford alluded to it, in the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions that since the start of 2014, a growing but emerging evidence base that Ukrainians, especially but not exclusively women and girls, are victims of rape, gang rape and forced nudity perpetrated by Russian military troops. And my colleague from Pontypridd is right. So often in these cases there is denial and dismissal, and we are seeing that in Israel right now. And actually we're seeing it in Gaza too, because there have been very credible reports. Yeah. And we come from a position in this country, those of us who want to tackle violence against women, where we believe, because we know how hard it is to come forward and report in the first place. So we believe until the evidence proves otherwise. But the evidence basis that we have got is very clear. And I want to allude to that because I know there'll be people watching this. I've seen myself the querying, the questioning, the double bluffing about whether or not sexual violence is taking place. The evidence basis of the Special Representative, the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, included interviews with 34 individuals, survivors and witnesses of the October 7 attacks, released hostages, first responders and health and service providers. 5,000 photographic images were reviewed and 50 hours of footage of the attacks. These are not in passing recollections. This has been a systematic approach to identifying what has happened. I can see the member opposite wish to intervene.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. And both she and the original proposer of this debate have stressed the organised nature of what happened on the 7th of October. But no one has yet said what the reason was for that. And the principal reason, as far as I can see, was to try and goad the Israelis into precisely the sort of overreaction, thus alienating world opinion from their cause, as that on which they have subsequently embarked. So if it can be proven that the mass rape and other sexual abuse was planned by the organisers of Hamas, does it not follow from that that they, as well as the actual perpetrators of these attacks, must face retribution in the international courts eventually.
Stella Creasy.
Many of us have consistently called for all allegations of war crime, and the use of sexual violence in war is a war crime. We should be absolutely clear about that, to be investigated. And indeed, I want to go on to develop an argument around that. But what I would just say is I think it's really important today of all days, and in this debate of all debates, that we centre the victims of sexual violence, so we don't go down perhaps some of the rabbit holes about is this a strategy in war, because it is one of the things that those who have studied these situations point out, that it's not inevitable. It's not an inevitable tactic. There are decisions being made. And in doing that, we deny the voices of women to be heard in their own right who require accountability and justice. Because if it is something that happens as a matter of course in war, then when you end a war, you end the problem, job done. And as I said at the start, actually the challenge is not just to stop sexual violence, but prevent it and to take it out of this arena altogether. So I hope the member will understand if I'm very firmly focused on the evidence of sexual violence and assault in war. And the challenge that we face from the UN and the work that they've done, that they've also recognised it and concerns in Palestine. And I think it is worth looking at the Special Rapporteur also went to Ramallah, and she highlighted, as my colleague from Pontypridd pointed out, instances of sexual violence in the context of detention, particularly invasive body searches, beatings, including in the genital areas, and the threats of rape against women and family members. My point is that none of this is inevitable. It's also not just... absolutely, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm listening with intent into the speech that the honourable member is making, and she's talking about how we do have to hear women's voices, and obviously that is something I think that we all hold in common. But will she agree with me, it's just not enough for us in Britain, important though that is, to pronounce here in the debate in Westminster Hall our horror and our anger and our determination to prevent this from happening. It's really absolutely vital that the international institutions, the UN and others, give far greater priority to looking at sexual violence as wars evolve, rather than as an aftermath after a war may come to an end.
Yeah. Stella Creasy.
As ever, the member from Barking prefigures what I'm going to argue about that mindset change and that cultural change. As I say, the idea that as long as we stop the war, we'll stop the violence, and that's enough, is not enough. And that's what we need to change. I just also want to come on to recognising that it's not just about sexual violence by states. My colleague again from Strangford, however, I find myself in much agreement as I get older. I don't know whether that's accidental or deliberate. He was talking about Boko Haram. We have seen in conflicts around the world the use of violence by insurgent organisations. NGOs report sexual violence often occurs in religious conflicts, particularly in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan, where sexual violence is used to keep minority communities in their place. Almost 10 years ago, ISIS seized huge swathes of Iraq and Syria and launched a genocidal campaign against the Yazidis in northern Iraq. 6,000 women and children were captured. To this day, half of them are still missing. The captive women and children were used for sexual slavery and trafficking. And one of the most horrifying moments for me about the Yazidi community and how they deal with the trauma of that is that those women who are still missing, those who are not presumed dead, many are considered to stay displaced because they are staying with children who have been the product of rape, and they face an impossible choice in being separated from their children if they return to freedom. Boko Haram is a good example where women have been brutalised by insurgents and then further brutalised by the state, frankly, stigmatised by government state action. In Nigeria, the governor of Borno State, Kashim Shettima, has publicly warned that those women who've become pregnant by Boko Haram fighters could breed a new generation of terrorists. Therefore, he has advocated for those women to be educated not to bring up their children to be terrorists. The cycle of blame and shame continuing on. It's also not just women and girls who are at risk, and again, my colleague from Strangford is absolutely right. There is evidence from the Red Cross that particularly there is sexual and gender-based violence against men, boys, and particularly LGBTQI people in humanitarian settings, and also against refugees. one of the most depressing studies you will ever read that shows approximately 1 in 5 refugees of displaced women have experienced sexual violence as part of fleeing a conflict zone. So we condemn without reservation those who question and query whether sexual violence happens. We condemn without reservation any of those people who sought to minimise it or say in some conflicts it's less of an issue than others. It is all an issue. The reason why that matters is because over 90% of survivors of sexual violence do not report to the police or officials in these conflict zones because of their lack of faith that anything is going to happen. And it is understandable when you look at the mixed record of our action, and that's where I think my colleague from Barking is absolutely right. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda does not reflect the high levels of sexual violence that we know happened in that conflict in their record for action. In contrast, obviously, what's happened in the former Yugoslavia, we've seen 93 individuals indicted, 44 of those were for crimes involving sexual violence, and of those 44, 29 were convicted, representing a 69% conviction rate.
I'm going to call the final speaker at 3:18.
Oh,
minutes. Sorry.
I do apologise. I'm sorry.
No, you're giving a
time.
wonderful speech. It's just I've got to get the last speaker in.
Absolutely. So let me then say 3 very clear things. Sexual violence, when it happens in conflict, is not an accident. It is deliberate. Whether it's organised or it happens progressively, it is not an accident. Secondly, it's not inevitable. Research of the analysis over the last 45 years of sexual violence in conflict shows it's been different in different conflicts. So, for example, rape was widespread in the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Timor-Leste, but far more less likely in El Salvador. That's why we have to break the cycle. You only break the cycle by saying it matters. That's why my call and appeal to the Minister is that we have an explicit accountability mechanism for the allegations of sexual violence in Israel and Palestine as part of the peace process, as one of the demands that the UK makes. Let's not brush this under the carpet. Let's not say, well, now the conflict has been resolved, we all desperately want that urgent ceasefire, that is enough. Let us have accountability for all of these mechanisms. I'll happily give way, I was going to sit down.
Just to say, Sir Charles, that the UK has made an offer to Israel and Palestine to support evidence gathering and technical support on the issue of CSRV as per the SRSG Patterns report.
Stella Creasy, 1 more minute.
Can he also clarify that they have made representations with the United Nations and the International Criminal Court for a specific criminal tribunal process for this conflict to be part of the ceasefire negotiations, so that all actors, including Hamas and Israel and the third-party actors who are supporting the peace process, recognise it, respect it, contribute to it and prioritise it?
Here, here.
Right. I imagine that will be answered in the wind-up. The Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Walker, and I'm very pleased that we're having this debate today, and I congratulate the member for Washington on securing this debate and the way she introduced it about the horrors of the violence against women on October the 7th in Israel, and then the continuing conflict in Gaza and the violence against women and children that's going on there and in other parts of the world. And as the member for Walthamstow quite correctly pointed out, that the time to investigate, if possible, is while the conflict is going on, or at least the preservation of evidence so far as that is possible during a conflict. But that is never a particularly easy thing to do. In the opening lines, the member also pointed out the levels of conflict around the world and the prevalence of sexual violence, particularly against women and children, in all wars going on at the present time in Yemen, going on at the present time in Ukraine, and the prevalence of sexual violence in other conflicts going back, such as Vietnam and others. It is sadly not a new situation, but one that we have to address and do everything we can about. I wanted, if I may, to particularly refer to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I have many constituents from the DRC, and they have often talked to me about it. And if I could, in the few minutes I have, Mr Walker, just quote from the report given by Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, at the Human Rights Council on the 4th of March of this year, so that's only a couple of months ago, about the DRC. I fear the enjoyment of human rights in the country has come to a grinding halt. The absence of state authority over large swathes of the territory has also cleared the way for brutal levels of violence and attacks. The The insecurity is being fuelled by a seemingly impassable mountain of challenges, from large-scale corruption to the unbridled race between multiple parties to take control of and exploit the country's wealth and natural resources, to ongoing violent land disputes. Between the 1st of October and the 15th of March 24, the UN Joint Human Rights Office documented 2,100 human rights violations and abuses throughout the DRC. 59% of these were committed by armed groups. Almost half of those violations and abuses were committed in the North Kivu province. The UN Joint Human Rights Office has documented 156 people who were summarily executed by the M23. M23 was also found to have sexually abused 30 women and children. Amnesty International goes on to report that 38,000 cases of sexual violence were reported in North Kivu during the first quarter of 2023. That is in the first 3 months of last year. And in May 23, Doctors Without Borders said levels of sexual violence and internally displaced camps around Goma reached an unprecedented catastrophic state. The UN Population Fund says between 21 and 22 there was a 91% rise in reports of gender-based violence in North Kivu province, and their mobile clinic reports on the number of people they're trying to assist who are victims of this. The situation is unbelievably appalling of what is going on there. And a report by the TG Foundation in a study by the American Journal of Public Health published in June 11 stated that 48 women were raped per hour in the Congo, and this would mean that since the start of the Congo war with Rwanda, an estimated 12.5 million Congolese women have been raped, and goes on to demand action by international governments over the behaviour not just of the government in the Congo and of the armed forces and of the armed groups, but also the relationship with Rwanda by the Congolese government and the mineral companies there. I just want to put this on record, and having on occasions, several occasions in fact, visited the DRC, I've never forgotten arriving in Goma after a very complicated journey by road from Kigali. It was almost dark, and we went to a women's centre, and it was by that time completely dark. And the audience that was waiting for us, there was a small delegation of us, was 300 or 400 women, all of whom had been victims of rape and wanted some degree of closure on the horror of their experience, if that is possible, but they also wanted some degree of international recognition of the horrors they were going through, where the armed groups routinely use rape as a weapon of war. Behind this, of course, is the thirst for minerals in the Congo. It is the search for cobalt and coltan, and it is the use of child labour as well as the exploitation of women in doing that. And it's the international mining companies that wash their hands of this and pretend they're buying the vital minerals from responsible sources. They're not. They're buying them second-hand from the exploited children and others that have suffered this in the Congo. And so we have to put this in that wider context of insecurity there. We're very proud in Islington to have one of our councillors who herself comes from the Congo, Micheline Ngongo, and she just sent me a message, and quite a long message, I won't read it all, but she says, loss of income and food insecurity can lead to the spiking of violence and abuse. And she goes on to say that the high level of incidence of abuse reflects the gender inequality and poverty of so many people in the DRC. And so when the Minister replies, I hope you'll be able to say what we're also doing about the question of the breakdown of any form of law process in the Congo to try and protect women and children from the violence that they're going through, and what demands we're making of the mineral companies, both in this country, in Switzerland, China, and elsewhere, who are buying minerals knowing they've been produced in the most appalling circumstances. And the victims of this are women who have no means to protect themselves, no defence whatsoever. And so rape has just become a pandemic of violence against women in the DRC. And I hope that we can reflect that in the policies that we pursue.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much.
Charles, and thank you to everyone who has taken part in this debate, and especially to the member for Washington and Sunderland West who brought the debate here. And I'd just like to add one more thanks to my colleague from Livingston's staff team who provided me with some information in advance of this debate. We've heard already that sexual-based violence is increasing in conflict zones, and that at a time where we should be moving forwards, we're moving backwards. This is a difficult subject to talk about. It's an uncomfortable subject to talk about, but it's incredibly important that we do talk about it. It is incredibly important that we do highlight the issues that are being faced around the globe, particularly by women and girls. And I am really pleased to hear that as a House we are standing together on this, that we are saying that this is illegal, that this is immoral, and that this is unacceptable, and that we will work together, we will support the government, all of us, in taking action to eradicate this. I think we're speaking, it feels to me, with one voice in this regard, that we do not believe that this should be allowed to continue. I want to talk about a number of things. I'll try and do what the member for Walthamstow did in terms of censuring victims and their views in the comments that I make. I want to say that, to begin with, that although I may mention a few individual situations in countries, all war crimes, all of those war crimes that are being committed, everybody that commits those, regimes or individuals, should be held to account, no matter who it is that is committing them, and no matter who it is that they're being committed on. Every single one of those we should be considering is incredibly important. And I agree again, just one more thing to pick up on with the member from Walthamstow in relation to the explicit accountability for sexual crimes in Israel and Palestine. I think that is especially key, and I was pleased to hear the Minister's comments in relation to that. Around reporting and the mechanisms that there are around reporting sexual violence, we must ensure that we increase the reporting that there is, that we increase the ability for individuals to report, and we increase the safety of making those reports. We know that in Afghanistan, what happened is that those people who had been subject to sexual violence, when the Taliban came in Afghanistan and dismantled the systems that were in place there, that those women who had reported and been victims of sexual violence, because those systems and protections that were in place around them were dismantled, were at further risk of being attacked again, of being ostracised, of being left out of their communities as a result of that. That is completely and totally unacceptable, and the UK should be using whatever powers that it has and can, whether those are soft powers or more extreme powers, to ensure that those protections that are in place in any country in relation to sexual violence reporting, that they stay no matter which regime is in charge, and that those victims are protected or saved from those situations. I think the debate has emphasised the importance of supporting the universal application of human rights and supporting the developments in the rule of law. I think that we should ensure that anyone that comes forward, we are doing everything that we can as an international power to ensure that they do not face reprisals for reporting, to ensure that they do not face reprisals for coming forward. Otherwise, how can we have the clearest possible picture of what is happening, and how can we ensure that we are using the powers that we have to prevent that from happening in any conflict? As was mentioned already by a number of different people, including the member from Islington, women and girls are disproportionately impacted in crises, and sexual violence is often used in both conflict and actually also in post-conflict zones. And I think the importance of saying that refugees and those who are displaced are also at risk and continue to be at risk, even though they may have escaped that war zone, is key. And particularly, we know that there are so many people that are currently displaced just now, and actually we need to ensure that they are being protected in whatever scenario they are currently in, whatever country they are currently hiding in. In Afghanistan, there's evidence to suggest that sexual violence is being used as an interrogation tool against detained women in Afghanistan. That is torture.
That is torture that these women are facing, and we should be doing what we can to condemn that violence towards women. A number of people mentioned Boko Haram. The nationalities in my constituency, the countries of birth in my constituency, go UK, Polish, Romanian, Nigerian. So I have a significant number of Nigerian constituents, some of whom have got family members who have been affected by the actions of Boko Haram. The fact that a third of those schoolgirls who were abducted 10 years ago are still in captivity, who are still in sexual slavery, who are still in domestic servitude, are in that horrific situation where they have got children in these situations and they cannot find a sensible way out that ensures that they can protect their children and also have their freedom. It's also mentioned about the 3,000 Yazidis, many of whom experienced sexual violence and are still missing in a very similar situation. We should never be quiet about this. We should continue to raise what has happened and what is happening. We should continue to condemn those who have taken these women and girls away from their families. The Honourable Lady from Washington and Sunderland West talked about the horrific sexual violence that occurred on October the 7th, and a number of other people mentioned that and the fact that it was planned and systemic. And, you know, in some ways it's even more horrific because of the planning that went behind it. But for every one of those women or girls or men or young men who were targeted, the ripples go far beyond what happened on that day. We know that sexual violence is not something that affects you during the initial crime and then you forget all about it. The ongoing impact of that on people's lives, we need to ensure that not just are we trying our best to prevent that, are we doing what we can to condemn it, but that we're putting the supports in place afterwards for people to be able to recover as best as they possibly can. And we are supporting other regimes in order to ensure that they can put that protection around those victims of sexual violence. And ensure allowing them to, allowing the ones that did survive, absolutely, but also allowing those who may still be in the hostage situation. You know, once they are freed, we need to be ensuring that they're getting the support that they need to get through that. The situation in the West Bank has escalated, and we do have issues with women and girls being disproportionately impacted. Violence and conflict increases the structural inequalities that there are already, and we know that women and girls are already disadvantaged, and that any conflict situation means that they are further disadvantaged. Anything in relation to sexual violence, including rape, sexual slavery, forced pregnancy and forced marriages, all of those are used as weapons of war. They're used in ways to genocide communities. Just lastly, I know not very much time, Sir Charles, we need to do what we can to support women's leadership. The UK government needs to take action. Women have got a leading role to play, not just in rebuilding communities, but also in brokering peace, in ensuring that those systems and support mechanisms are in place, and ensuring that women's voices are heard. In too many countries around the world, women do not have that platform. Women are not able to make the case for other women. I'd like the UK government specifically to look at the UN report on sexual violence. I'd like them to integrate gender analysis into planning and responding to emergencies and conflicts. Because we know about those structural inequalities. And I've got far more I could have said, but just lastly, I want to mention the work that the Scottish Government has been doing in ensuring that the funding that it has, the aid money that it has, is being used to support and empower women and girls whenever we can. In 2016 to 18, gender-based violence aid funding was only 0.1% of total humanitarian funding. And that is grim when we know that the situation that so many women and girls are in right now.
Thank you. Shadow Minister.
Very grateful, Mr. Walker. It's a pleasure as ever to serve under you as our chair. And I want to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Washington and Sunderland West, for bringing forward this really important debate. She made an absolutely excellent contribution. It's been a good debate this afternoon, I think. As we've heard, horrific sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war in conflicts around the world. And across this House,
We are absolutely united, I believe, in our opposition to this, no matter where it occurs and who the perpetrators are. So I'm very, very grateful to my honourable friend for creating time for us to talk, not just about this utter horror and the damage it does, but how we can play our part in supporting solutions as well. I want to start today. I hope honourable members will forgive me if I focus on a few of the African contexts that we continue to see sexual violence used as a weapon on a truly appalling scale. And I'll start with the ongoing generals' war against the people of Sudan, against the women and the girls of Sudan. There have been 5,000 reports of grave violations in Sudan, including sexual violence. But this is so likely to be an underestimate, given that 60,000 survivors of sexual violence and conflict have been identified in Sudan as of June 2023, which is almost a year ago now. Sexual violence by armed men have been reported in areas across Sudan, with many different groups targeted. In Khartoum, Sudanese women and girls and whole families have been raped in their homes and in the street. In Darfur, targeted sexual violence against the Masalit and other non-Arab Darfuris has formed a major component of the ethnic cleansing campaigns. The link between racism, misogyny and the political agenda of some armed groups in Darfur has been evidenced again and again. Women being attacked are labelled slaves using racist slurs. I just want to quote a few words from Al Jazeera report which sums up the utterly chilling mentality of these rapists. After we rape you, you will carry our babies to change the non-Arab portion within the Sudanese blood. These patterns of targeted violence against women and girls in both Khartoum and Darfur are mostly attributed to the RSF or their allied forces. The UN reported in February that one victim was held by the RSF and gang raped repeatedly for 35 days. The sheer horror of this, I honestly, as a woman, can't comprehend how one might survive that. And there are continued reports of sexual violence used to intimidate women's rights activists, often attributed to the Sudanese armed forces. The healthcare system has almost entirely collapsed. Few of the women victimised by rape can access the immediate support needed, with physical and mental trauma, risks of infection, or with risks of pregnancy. And the UN has reported that women who've tried to access abortion have been denied it because Sudan's 90-day legal window to obtain an abortion in the case of rape had passed. So we must continue to work together against the stigmatism of children born following rape and to argue for universally accessible abortion for all women who face these terrible circumstances. And we need to redouble our efforts to stop the generals' war in Sudan and support forces for sustainable peace and justice. Because right now, in Darfur, hundreds of thousands remain trapped in the city of El Fasher, under siege in famine conditions and with the imminent threat of attack by the RSF. It's already an atrocity. How many more women and children will be targeted for rape and violence if El Fasher falls? The international community must surely act now to protect the civilians trapped in that city. And I hope the Minister will be able to say something about the government's plans for actions and what immediate further steps the UK might make. Sadly, the horrors I've described from Sudan are familiar from other recent and continued conflicts, as we've heard. But I've spoken many times about the large-scale and often ethnically targeted sexual violence that was evidenced in Ethiopia during the Tigray War. UN experts have estimated that this conflict has left 10,000 survivors of sexual violence, mostly women and girls, with very limited support. So I'd like to ask the Minister if he's able to update us on the government's engagement with Ethiopia over the process of accountability for these abuses. Sadly, that threat is far from over, because conflicts between ethnically organised armed groups continue in many areas of Ethiopia, including Amhara, Tigray, Oromia and the southwest. And the threat to women and girls is even greater in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as my right honourable friend spoke of in his contribution today, particularly among the hundreds of thousands of civilians forcibly displaced by the M23's advance. The M23, of which there's credible evidence of material Rwandan support.
And I'm pleased she's mentioned that. The reality is, in the Congo, there are 7 million people have been displaced. The world's media barely recognise this, barely registers on their scale, and it is probably the greatest abuse of human rights anywhere in the world at the present time.
Minister.
I understand where he's coming from, and I utterly agree. Let me quote the heartbreaking words of a 15-year-old girl called Florence, 15 years old. One of them took me by force, strangled me, and they raped me one after another. He had strangled me so much that I no longer had the strength to scream. The rape survivors that Save the Children are supporting in the DRC are as young as 9 years old. The impact of this on children, women, families and communities is enormous. But we can't be content with just raising our voices repeatedly against these atrocities. We need a clear strategy for how the UK can play its part. For me, preventing sexual violence must be integral to the wider approach to conflicts and violence. These horrific cases, whether in Sudan, Ethiopia, DRC, they don't end at those countries' borders. They spill over into the wider region. They undermine security for many communities. And to truly prevent this, we have to recognise how it works politically. The perpetrators are individual men, soldiers, commanders and politicians, but their violence can only take hold because the state fails to stop it. Ultimately, this will only stop when there are robust state institutions, justice systems to hold to account, and security forces who protect communities rather than bearing responsibility for the violations themselves. But in contexts like Sudan, there are no trustworthy state authorities that play that part. So I believe we have to be smarter in the way we act. We have to look beyond the easy options of international NGOs and expensive consultants and be far more open to working directly with small local organisations. In Sudan, there are many women's groups and other local organisations who are opposed to both military factions. They're a force for peace, democracy and justice, and at the same time they're providing support to survivors of rape in their own communities. So my main question to the government today is, why aren't we doing more to support them? Why aren't we supporting the Sudanese women who challenge the power of the generals, the men who've plunged the country into this nightmare and put millions of sisters in such dire risk? Why don't we recognise that building the capacity of local organisations is a strategic intervention in the UK's interest? Because we can't see this issue in terms of silos. It's humanitarian, it's a medical response, it's development, it's accountability, it's justice, it's diplomacy and sanctions, it's peace building, it's all these things. And let's face it, our resources are limited, and the challenges in regions like the Horn of Africa are massively complex and interconnected. So I think it's more important to break down the barriers and recognise that unless our interventions help solve many challenges simultaneously, they won't be effective. They won't support our efforts to build strong partnerships for mutual benefit in Africa, and they won't genuinely help to prevent this horrific form of abuse that continues to blight our world.
Thank you very much. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Charles. It's a pleasure to appear before you once again. I'm incredibly grateful to the Honourable Member for Washington and Sunderland West, an area where I first stood for Parliament 41 years ago, for securing this debate on preventing sexual violence in conflict. She made an excellent speech, and I will try and respond to much of what she has said, but I will look at all the ideas that she put forward, and any that I don't cover during my remarks I will write to her about afterwards. I'm also incredibly grateful for the contributions of all honourable members. I will try to respond to the points raised, but this has been an outstanding debate, and I feel very privileged to be able to try and respond for the government. My honourable friend for Strangford said that he had never known so much violence and misery in the world as he sees today, and he always brings so much to these debates. It is one of the reasons why Britain has put aside £1 billion this year to meet humanitarian need, and I'm grateful to him for recognising that the UK is a global leader in that respect. The Honourable Lady for Pontypridd, I thought, made an outstanding speech. She spoke up about the horrendous events of October the 7th and the lack of response by parts of the international community, and she called for the immediate release of the hostages, and I thought she spoke with a great feeling when she said that Me Too, unless you are a Jew, has been something that has resonated with parts of the community, and she spoke also with great eloquence about Ukraine and Sudan. And the House will be grateful for what she has said, and I hope that many people who are not able to be here tonight will read the power of her contribution. The Honourable Lady for Walthamstow mentioned the importance of the International Day to End CRSV on the 19th of June. She talked about the importance of focusing very directly on the victims of this dreadful violence, and she made the point that the whole House will echo, that there can be no impunity. And the Honourable Gentleman for Islington North, the former leader of the Labour Party, he spoke about the DRC, he spoke about Goma and the terrible humanitarian tragedy which for years has unfolded in the Kivus, an area I have visited over the last 20 years on a number of occasions, as has he. What the government does is to urge all of the military forces to lay down their arms and support the various different political processes, particularly in Nairobi and Luanda, to try and ensure that there's a political track to end this terrible violence. And on the specific thing, he asked me what more could be done on the issue of minerals. He will know of the work of the EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and the government wants to see more effort made in that respect to follow and track the minerals. The Honourable Lady for Aberdeen North said at the beginning that this is a difficult subject to talk about. She then did so very well. She again spoke about there being no tolerance of impunity and the terrible legacy from the teenage young women who were taken by Boko Haram. She talked about the role of women, women's voice in conflict resolution and the work of ending GBV, and again ensuring the importance of accountability. And the Honourable Lady who speaks for the opposition for West Ham talked about the whole of the subject today, but in particular about Sudan, the terrible events, the particular role that Britain has through the Troika and through holding the pen at the UN. She talked about Darfur, the dreadful situation in Al-Fasher, about which the government has spoken up, the clear evidence in Darfur of ethnic cleansing. And again, the demands of the international community are that the troops should return to barracks and enable the humanitarians to operate in these dreadful circumstances and open a political track as soon as possible. And Britain is supporting the collection of, through open source means, of evidence. We will make sure that that evidence is retained for future use. And on Ethiopia, she again focused on the situation there. Britain supports the Pretoria Agreement. We've done a lot of work to help to head off famine conditions, including in Geneva just a few weeks ago, supporting a replenishment, which I co-chaired with the Ethiopian Foreign Minister, which raised £610 million. And she also talked about the harrowing evidence and work of NGOs like Save the Children. I'm sure the entire House agrees that conflict-related sexual violence, or CSRV, CRSV in short, is not an inevitable consequence of war. It is morally abhorrent, illegal, and does not discriminate. It affects women and girls and men and boys, as we have heard too, and has devastating consequences, and yet it continues to take place in conflicts around the world, often used as a deliberate tactic to terrorize entire communities. We are witnessing its horrific impacts in Ukraine, Sudan and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, just to name a few. And the whole House was particularly horrified by the reports which have been mentioned today of sexual violence on and since the 7th of October. And the Honourable Lady spoke eloquent about this in her opening remarks, as did the Right Honourable Lady for Barking, about the appalling violence perpetrated by Hamas on that day. I'm afraid I won't because of the time, but if I have a second at the end, I promise my Right Honourable friend I will. We have clearly and unequivocally condemned all allegations of reports of CRSV in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories and led calls for a UN Security Council debate on this specific issue. And we continue to call for thorough investigations, for hostages to be released immediately and for detainees to be treated with dignity and in line with international law. And we have also, on a number of occasions, including at the UN Security Council, offered PSVI expertise and tools to help ensure victims and survivors of CRSV receive the support that they need. Sir Charles, 12 years since the launch of the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, the PSVI in short, I pay tribute to Lord Ahmed as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, Lord Haig, who started the exceptional focus by the UK on this, and Baroness Hellick for their tireless efforts. The UK is at the forefront of the fight to end this heinous crime, and I want to highlight very briefly 5 steps to demonstrate the impact of our work. First, since 2012, we have used our influence and convening power to draw global attention to this issue. Take, for example, the PSVI conference we hosted in London 2 years ago. We brought together over 1,000 delegates, including survivors, expert states and multilateral organisations. I personally led several sessions at that meeting, and collectively we succeeded in getting 54 countries to sign an ambitious political declaration to deliver change. At the conference, we also announced the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, and Lord Ahmed launched the alliance last year, and it brings together a range of global actors to prevent and respond to CRSV. Its membership continues to grow. It now has 26 members, including governments, multilateral organisations, civil society, and survivors. And we are working closely with the current chair, Colombia, to drive action through the alliance. And we have launched the PSVI strategy, backed by £12.5 million, with 4 clear objectives: to strengthen global response, to prevent sexual violence in conflict, to promote justice, and to support survivors. Second, we are coming up with creative solutions to prevent these crimes. For example, Britain's flagship Watch What Works Impact at Scale programme is encouraging and supporting innovative ideas. We've invested £67.5 million into the second phase of the programme. This is the biggest global commitment by any government to prevent gender-based violence. Third, we are setting a global benchmark by giving survivors a say in the decisions that affect them. Britain has appointed 2 PSVI survivor champions, called Basia Husu and Nadine Tunasi, and established a survivor advisory group to put survivors' voices at the heart of policy proposals. And since 2018, we've committed almost £8 million to the Global Survivors Fund to provide psychosocial and educational support for survivors. We know how important it is to ensure that we gather information from survivors safely. That is why 2 years ago we launched the Murad Code with the Yazidi human rights activists and Nobel Prize winner Nadia Murad to collect information responsibly and ethically. Fourth, Sir Charles, we are working to make these crimes punishable by law. Impunity may be the global norm, but that is unacceptable. The UK is taking steps to change it, and we have made some progress. We've sanctioned 14 perpetrators over the last 2 years, and we are boosting the capacity of countries to investigate and prosecute these crimes. For example, in Ukraine, we are supporting the Office of the Prosecutor General to investigate them effectively. We are also backing the draft UN Crimes Against Humanity Convention to make the global legal framework stronger and more effective, and we are working with the International Criminal Court to help survivors engage with courts using technology. I'm very grateful to Baroness Hellick, who I mentioned earlier, who is helping us to find new innovative solutions to tackle impunity, and I agree we still have a long way to go. Finally, I want to share 2 examples of the tangible impact we have had on the ground. Since 2012, we have deployed our PSVI team of experts over 90 times across the world. These highly trained independent individuals provide direct support to national and international bodies. They have helped plan missions, convene workshops, and supported governments execute their projects. UK programmes have also contributed to vital legislative changes in Bosnia and Herzegovina recently. And these changes will advance the rights of survivors and children born of CRSV, for example, by enabling them to access finance for higher education. To conclude, the 5 steps I've highlighted show that we have come a long way and our work matters. But there can be no doubt, particularly from what we have heard today, that we need to go further still, and our efforts are bearing fruit. We are making progress. The UK will continue to drive sustained, united and innovative action globally. That is the only way we can consign conflict-related sexual violence to the history books. And in the minute I have left, I give way to my right honourable friend.
Grateful to my right honourable friend. Does he agree with me that on October the 7th, the mass rapes were not a byproduct of the attacks, they were an integral part of the plan, as I said earlier, to provoke Israel? If that is proven, does not that mean that the people who planned the attacks, as well as the perpetrators themselves, must be held to account in international courts?
I completely agree, Sir Charles, with what my right honourable friend is saying about accountability. On October the 7th, as we know, there was the greatest murder of Jewish people at any time in one day since the Holocaust and the end of the Second World War. And the impact of that, about which we have heard so graphically today, underlines why it is so important that we continue this work which we are making progress on, because, above all, we have the unity, the drive and the support in all parts of the House, and that gives Britain a particular locus and focus internationally to make sure that this work is effectively pursued.
Thank you, Minister. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you very much. Can I just say, start by thanking all speakers today and to echo what people said about this being a very consensual and very important debate that we've had this afternoon. I want to thank the Minister for his contribution and also join him in thanking Baroness Hellick and the work of the PSVI. The 5 measures he outlined for us today, he spoke of are very welcome, but I still suggest that an international commission is needed to lead on this work, including the measures he suggested, and that also women's voices, and especially survivors of sexual violence in conflict, should be included in any peace negotiations going forward in those conflict areas, if we're ever really going to start to find a way through this for the survivors, but also that to ensure that their voices are heard. And I also think that the Honourable Gentleman, in his last intervention there, made a very important point about, in the most recent conflict, why this was intended and done the way it was. I agree with him that it was intentional, although it is seen in all conflicts, as we've discussed this afternoon. But I thank everyone for an excellent debate. Thank you.
The question is, if this House has considered sexual violence in conflict, if many opinions say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Well done. Well done, Andrew. Thank you.